Hi, I'm Pastor Kerry. Before we get started, there are a few things I want to encourage you to have. First, I want to encourage you to have a set of the sermon notes. If you don't already have them, you can go to the link that's right down below the video. It'll take you to a place where you can print a set of the sermon notes for yourself. I also want to encourage you to have some communion elements. You'll want to have some bread or a cracker. You'll want to have some juice or some wine. If you don't have juice or wine, probably any beverage would suffice. But you'll want to have those communion elements because here in about 20 minutes when we get to the end of the sermon, we'll move right into a time of communion with you. So if you need any of those things, I would encourage you to pause the video. Get whatever you need. Once everything is ready, then go ahead and resume the playback. So I don't know about you. I don't have a lot of memories from when I was in kindergarten. I was just 5 years old, but I do have one kind of humorous memory. It was the day before Valentine's Day, and that morning, our kindergarten teacher, I should say one of our kindergarten teachers, plural, told us that we were going to make Valentines for our classmates. And I know that I was really excited about that because there was a little girl that I had a crush on. I can't remember her name. I can still picture her face, but I can't remember her name. I think for the sake of this illustration, let's just say her name was Lisa. That might have been what it was, actually. But hey, regardless, the point is that I spent the next hour or so working very carefully and meticulously on the perfect Valentine for Lisa. And the teacher had told us we had an hour to make our Valentines, and so I was working hard on it. Now, you have to realize that with kindergartners, we had very limited artistic skills, and so I'm sure that whatever I created was not that impressive. On the other hand, I noticed that a lot of my classmates, that they were done after like 10 or 15 minutes, and they were on to other things. And so I was very proud of myself that I had put the full hour into this Valentine for Lisa. And after about 55 minutes had passed, I walked up to my teacher to show it, or to one of their teachers to show it to her, because I wanted her to see this beautiful Valentine that I had made for Lisa. And I was, of course, expecting her to say, "Oh my goodness, Carrie, that is the most beautiful Valentine that I have ever seen in my life." And I was so proud of myself. I took it to my teacher and I showed her the Valentine. And she said, "Great job, Carrie. That's really, really nice." She said, "Where are the rest of your Valentines?" Because I had misunderstood the assignment. I thought that we were just supposed to make a Valentine. I didn't realize that we were supposed to make Valentines for the entire class. And so I had spent the entire time just working on the one. And then with 5 minutes left, all of a sudden I had to crank out like 25 more Valentines that got zero effort or attention. And the reason that I have that humorous memory and that I wanted to share that with you today is because here I was feeling like I had done something incredible, like I had gone above and beyond. I had worked the entire hour on this one Valentine while the rest of my classmates put hardly any time or effort into theirs. I wanted some affirmation. I wanted to be commended for this incredible effort on my part. I go to the authority figure and she says, "Yeah, that's great, but you ain't nearly done. There's a whole lot more work that needs to be done." And I'm just wondering if that is how our friend Peter felt after he went to Jesus and told Jesus what he had decided to do. If you watched the sermon last Sunday, you know that last Sunday we took a look at Matthew chapter 18. And the way that Matthew chapter 18 starts is with a ridiculous question from the disciples to Jesus about which one of them is going to be the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. And Jesus basically says to them, "None of you." He says, "You see this little child, you have to become like this little child to be called greatest in the kingdom of heaven." And I'm sure that there were some of the disciples that were thinking when they asked Jesus that question that Jesus was going to say, "Oh, it's going to be you, Andrew. Oh, it's going to be you, John." I'm sure, from everything that we know about Peter, I'm sure that Peter was hoping that Jesus was going to say, "It's going to be Peter. He's the rock, and he is going to be the greatest in the kingdom of heaven." So I think that it is quite possible that Peter was still feeling just a little bit stung from the fact that he hadn't been identified as the greatest among the 12 disciples in the passage immediately before this. So now we're going to the passage immediately after the passage we looked at last week, where Jesus said, none of you guys are going to be greatest in the kingdom of heaven. It said you need to be like this little child. So now it feels like Peter is asking a follow-up question, hoping that he's going to get that pat on the back, hoping that he's going to get that attaboy that he didn't get in the first half of Matthew chapter 18. So without any further ado, let's take a look at our lectionary gospel reading for September the 17th of 2023. This is Matthew chapter 18, verses 21 through 35. Then Peter came to Jesus and asked, Lord, how many times shall I forgive my brother or sister who sins against me? Up to 7 times? Jesus answered, I tell you, not 7 times, but 77 times. Therefore the kingdom of heaven is like a king who wanted to settle accounts with his servants. As he began the settlement, a man who owed him 10,000 bags of gold was brought to him. Since he was not able to pay, the master ordered that he and his wife and his children and all that he had be sold to repay the debt. At this, the servant fell on his knees before him. Be patient with me, he begged, and I will pay back everything. And the servant's master took pity on him, canceled the debt, and let him go. But when that servant went out, he found one of his fellow servants who owed him 100 silver coins. He grabbed him and began to choke him. Pay back what you owe me, he demanded. His fellow servant fell to his knees and begged him, be patient with me, and I will pay it back. But he refused. Instead, he went off and had the man thrown into prison until he could pay the debt. When the other servants saw what had happened, they were outraged and went and told their master everything that had happened. Then the master called the servant in. You wicked servant, he said, I canceled all that debt of yours because you begged me to. Shouldn't you have had mercy on your fellow servant, just as I had on you? In his anger, his master handed him over to the jailers to be tortured until he should pay back all he owed. And this is how my heavenly Father will treat each of you unless you forgive your brother or sister from your heart. May God bless the reading of the powerful and extremely convicting word. So this passage is pretty in your face, isn't it? This passage is one where it starts with Peter trying again to get Jesus to say, hey, Peter, you're fantastic. And instead it ends with all of us going, whoa, that is tough. So let's start by doing what we always do. Let's talk through the passage. There's a few little things I want to point out in here that will probably help us understand this passage and this parable a little bit better. And then after we talk through this passage, what I want to do is I want us to focus on 4 of the deeper lessons that I think this passage has for us. Because I do think that the obvious lesson of this passage is simply this. I think the obvious lesson is if we want God to forgive us, then we need to forgive others. That's the obvious lesson. That's the obvious moral of the story. But I think there are some deeper lessons that we should take away from this message, take away from this parable as well. So let's go ahead and talk through the passage. Oh, our friend Peter, he was always the one who was sticking his foot in his mouth. And he comes to Jesus, again, like I said, after the passage we looked at last week, maybe he was wanting to get a little bit of redemption, maybe he was wanting to save face, maybe he's still wanting that pat on the back. So he says, you know what, Jesus, I have been thinking about it, and I have decided that I am going to forgive my brother or sister when they sin against me. I'm going to forgive them up to 7 times. Now, to you and me, that seems like, well, good grief, that's silly, because we should forgive them every time. However, there was a belief and an expectation in that culture in which they lived 2,000 years ago that you only had to forgive someone 3 times. Only 3 times. And so, Peter, when he went to Jesus and said, you know what, Jesus, I've been thinking, I'm going to forgive people 7 times. I'm sure, just like when I went to my kindergarten teacher with that Valentine and showed it to her and said, "Isn't this amazing?" And I was expecting her to say, "Boy, Carrie, that's fantastic. Good job." Instead, what she said was, "Yeah, Carrie, that's great. You realize you've got 20 more, or 25 more Valentines to go, right?" And that's basically what happened to Peter here. Jesus says to Peter, "Yeah, that's great. But you know what? Instead of 7 times, make it 77 times." In fact, that's how the New International Version translates it. The majority of the translations translate it as 70 times 7. So in other words, 490 times. So what does that really mean? 77 times, 490 times. Does that mean that we're supposed to be keeping track? I've got a logbook on my spouse, or on my parents, or on my children, or on my coworkers, or whoever. I've got a logbook, and I'm at 75 right now. Once I get to 78, I don't have to forgive them ever again. Or I've got the logbook and I've gotten to 489. Once I get to 490, I don't ever have to forgive him again. That's obviously not the point that Jesus was trying to make here. The point that Jesus was trying to make here is that we should always forgive. We should forgive every time. That there should be no limit to our forgiveness. And in that way, Jesus was going way above and beyond the custom that they had 2,000 years ago, where it was after 3 times that you could say, 3 strikes and you're out. I don't have to forgive you anymore. So that is the intro to the passage. And then Jesus told what's often known as the parable of the unmerciful servant. And so there in this parable is someone who's trying to settle accounts. The master has this man brought in who owes him 10,000 bags of gold. Now, one of the things that we have to remind ourselves that this is a parable. It's a story. This is probably not meant to be taken literally. There are meant to be exaggerations for the sake of dramatic effect in this story. And if you're wondering, 10,000 bags of gold, I mean, how much was that worth 2,000 years ago? Well, hold on to that thought, because we're going to come back and talk about that in a few minutes. But the man who owes his master 10,000 bags of gold gets down on his knees, says, "Please give me a little more time." And the master says, "You know what? I'm just going to erase all that debt. The debt is forgiven. You're off scot-free." And so this same servant who has just had this incredible debt forgiven, he walks out, he sees one of his fellow servants who owes him 100 silver coins. Now I know you're thinking to yourself, well, Pastor Gary, how much is 100 silver coins worth? I'm glad that you asked. I'm going to come back and answer that question in a few minutes as well. But as soon as he sees this fellow servant who owes him 100 silver coins, he says, "Pay me back what you owe me." And this fellow servant does exactly what he did with his master. He gets down on his knees and he begs and he says, "Give me just a little more time." And even though he has just had this massive debt forgiven and erased and forgotten about, he says to his fellow servant, "No dice." And he has this man in the story, in the parable, arrested and thrown into jail. The master finds out about it, and the master is understandably extremely unhappy at the double standard, at the hypocrisy. Calls him back in and says, "You know what? You're going to get the same way that you got," and has this first servant thrown into prison. And Jesus concludes with some incredibly sobering words for us as disciples. Jesus concludes by saying, this is how God is going to treat all of us unless we forgive each other from our hearts. So like we've said, the obvious lesson here is that we need to forgive. Otherwise, why would we expect for God to forgive us? But I do want to focus now on 4 of the even deeper lessons that we can take away from this passage. And the first lesson is this: how many times should we forgive others? And the answer is infinite times. How many times should we forgive others? Infinite times. So in this passage, Whether we say Jesus said to Peter that it was 77 times or 490 times, the point is that there should be no limit to how many times we should forgive each other. And look, I understand that it is hard, especially with someone who has made mistakes with us over and over again. It can be tough. But at the same time, the nature of our relationships is that there are always going to be people that hurt us. We are always going to have parents who have hopefully inadvertently hurt us. We're going to have siblings who have hurt us. We're going to have spouses who have hurt us. We're going to have children, maybe even grandchildren, that have hurt us. That's just the nature of our relationships. And can you imagine the world we would live in if we lived by the standard that they lived in 2,000 years ago, where we, after someone has hurt us 3 times and we've forgiven them 3 times, after that we don't have to forgive them again? My goodness. I mean, how many marriages would that end? How many strained relationships would that create? I think that all of us probably understand that God has no limit to how many times we are forgiven, and so that's the same standard that we should apply to others. It just logically follows. If that is how God is going to treat me, if God is going to have no ultimate limit, no 77, no 490 times that God is going to forgive me, then I can't have that standard with anybody here. It just makes sense. So that is the first lesson we should take away from this passage. The second lesson is this: how much has God forgiven us? The answer is an incredible amount. How much has God forgiven us? An incredible amount. In this passage, Jesus said that this servant owed the master 10,000 bags of gold. One of the commentaries that I looked at this week, and mind you, this commentary was written decades ago, so I'm sure with inflation that it was even more now, but one of the commentaries that I looked at said that the equivalent of 10,000 bags of gold in this day and age would be about $10 million. $10 million. Do you have $10 million lying around? I know that I don't have $10 million lying around that I can go and repay any debts. It's impossible, and that's the point that Jesus was trying to make. That's the point of this parable. There is no way for us to repay all the mistakes, all of the forgiveness that we have received from God. It's just not possible. And that leads then to the next lesson that we should take away from this passage. In comparison, how much will we forgive others? And the answer is a very small amount. In comparison, how much will we forgive others? A very small amount. So in this passage, Jesus says the first servant owed the master 10,000 bags of gold, the equivalent of $10 million. And so then, when the servant goes out, sees his fellow servant, and the fellow servant owes him 100 silver coins. What's that worth in modern terms? Well, in the same commentary that I looked at this past week, the modern equivalent is $20. That's right, $20. That's how much that this fellow servant owed the first servant. Now, I know you're probably thinking to yourself, wait a minute, you can't have someone thrown into jail for a $20 debt. And of course you can't have someone thrown into jail, at least not in this day and age. I can't really speak to how the legal system worked 2,000 years ago. But again, it's a parable, and there are exaggerations built into the parable for dramatic effect. The point that Jesus was trying to make is he was saying it's like comparing a debt of $10 million to a debt of $20. There's no comparison. And when I think about all the mistakes that I have made in my life, mistakes that I've made toward God, mistakes that I've made towards my brothers and sisters, and then when I think about the mistake that this person has made towards me, or the mistakes that this person has made toward me, there is no comparison. It's like $10 million versus $20. And that's what Jesus was trying to help Peter, and by extension trying to help us to understand. There's no comparison. Now, I want to pause and I want to acknowledge something right here. I realize that some of the people who are watching this video, that you have had people over the course of your life that have done absolutely awful, unspeakable things to you. My hope is that the vast majority of the people who will watch this video haven't had that experience. But I am sure that some of the people who are watching this video have had that happen to them. And so what I want to say to you first of all is I acknowledge that, and I am incredibly sorry that you have had those awful, unspeakable things happen to you. Whether they happened to you when you were a little kid, whether they happened to you as an adult. I acknowledge those, and I want to say to you that ultimately, my hope is that you can find some way to make some peace. And I think that one of the ways that you can make some peace is ultimately to forgive. Even if what that person did to you, whether it was decades ago, whether it was recently, even if what that person did to you is unforgivable, I hope that you can find some peace and that you can find a way to forgive for your own sake, if nothing else. And I realize that maybe the person who did something awful to you decades ago, maybe they never apologized. And maybe they're no longer with us. And maybe they can't apologize to you. Or maybe you went and you sought an apology and they refused to apologize to you. I want to acknowledge all of those scenarios. Or maybe a different scenario that I haven't even mentioned up to this point. If there's something that's holding you back from forgiveness, I want you to know that I understand. But I still want to encourage you to try to find a way to forgive. Because ultimately that forgiveness is going to free you from the awful thing that has happened to you. So, that's a whole nother sermon to itself. And I realize I'm not doing that topic justice right now, but I want to at least acknowledge that very quickly. And very quickly, so that we can move to our time of communion. How must we therefore forgive? And the answer is from the heart. How must we therefore forgive? From the heart, because God knows our heart. I can say about this person, oh, I forgive him, when really, maybe I haven't in my heart. Friends, God knows our heart. And so that's why it's so important for me to forgive from the heart. That's why it's so important for you to forgive from the heart. And friends, every time we gather around the Lord's table, we are celebrating the forgiveness that we received. On the night when Jesus was betrayed, he took bread and broke it and said, "This is my body which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me." And in the same way after the supper, he took the cup and said, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this whenever you drink in remembrance of me." All of this for our forgiveness. And so right now I want to invite you to take your communion elements as I take mine. And I'm afraid this video is going to cut me off, but at least we're going to try to get started on communion. I would invite you to partake with me at this time. The body of Christ, broken for us, we partake in remembrance of him. And the blood of Christ, shed for us, we drink in remembrance of him. Let us pray. God, thank you for the divine